Why did you leave your last job? How to answer. Everybody's favorite question. You go to a job interview and they ask you a string of questions. A lot of them are completely lame and unintuitive. And this is one of the standard job interview questions that you may encounter. And everybody loves it. They ask you this to make you squirm because it's a negativity question. That means they're asking you about something that's bad. So you answer by saying something bad. That's what they're hoping for. And this can be very conflicting because are you at the job interview to talk about bad things? Of course not. Of course not. But you feel that you must do it to appease them in some way. And so especially a lot of new job seekers are conflicted by questions like this. They don't know what to do here. Let's get into it. Okay, so first of all, I have to do this almost every time. I have to explain that this question can be phrased a variety of ways. So they may not use the exact words. How was I phrasing it? Why did you leave your last job? They may phrase it a different way. They may say, have you ever quit a job? Something like that. It's the same question where you're being asked to talk about the same thing, but they're using different words to phrase it, right? So anytime they ask you about your previous job, what was your previous job? Why did you leave? Anything to do with leaving a job, all that kind of stuff, it's the same question. So I just want to say that. Now, why do they ask this question? They ask it for a couple of different reasons, right? A lot of people out there who are like me, you might be technical people, technically minded, you might be introverted, you pay more attention to the literal question you're being asked as opposed to context clues to inform you what they might really be asking. Because as we all know, there's usually a question behind a question. Okay, that's certainly the case in job interviews. And this is no exception. First thing they're wondering about is why did you leave your last job? That's the obvious thing. But beyond that, they're asking this question for other reasons. And sometimes these are the more important reasons. One is to determine if you're going to badmouth somebody. Okay. They've just met you, you're making your first impression, and they're wondering if they ask you about something, like a bad boss or an unpleasant experience. Let's say you left a job because it was unpleasant. Are you the type of person that's going to badmouth those people? Because if you are, then the presumption is that if you can badmouth them, you will badmouth these people here if they were to hire you. Okay, if there's something about them that you don't like, you won't be ashamed to say it to anyone who wants to know. So it's kind of like a test where they bait you just to see if you're going to take the bait, right? And if you do, and if you're forthcoming and you give them exactly what they asked for, you lose. See, what a wonderful game. Okay, the other problem that this question has, like I mentioned, is it's a negativity question. They ask you about something that's bad. And in order to appease them and answer the question, you have to start talking about bad things, right? So they could say, for example, what's the worst thing about you? Like that would be a negativity question. In order to give them what they want, you would have to then talk about how you're bad at stuff, right? Now, there's a conflict. Are you at the job interview to talk about how bad you are at stuff? Of course not, right? What kind of first impression are you leaving if you were to answer that question fully and completely? Well, you'd be shooting yourself in the foot, right? And that's also what's going on here. Usually when you leave something, it's not a good reason. Either you quit, which might be bad. It might suggest that you're someone who quits, or you were let go, which, is also not a good thing. It could suggest that you're not a good employee, right? Or you were terminated, which is even worse, right? What kind of person are you if the last job you had, you were fired from, right? What kind of first impression does that make? So this is what they're asking you about. And it's not as simple as just answering it plainly, honestly, giving them full and complete information because you succeed in eliminating yourself. That's the problem here. Okay. So a couple of things here. If you're new to this, remember, in a job interview, never say anything bad about anyone. Okay. Don't talk bad about a previous job. Don't talk bad about a previous boss or coworkers, and don't say anything bad about yourself. Okay. you follow that and you should do well. Okay. Now, always remember also that in a job interview, we always tell the truth. Okay. We shouldn't be engaging in outright lies. Okay. And I'm deadly serious when I say usually those don't work. They don't work out in the end. Now, because we don't tell lies, that doesn't automatically mean that we disclose everything. Okay? So remember that. We always tell the truth, but we don't always have to disclose everything. The job interview is not a deposition. You're not in a court of law. You're not under oath. Okay? They can ask anything they want. Does that mean that you must answer any question they ask you? No, it doesn't. There are quite a few things that are just none of their damn business, but they will ask you anyway. And any interaction between you and a third party that doesn't involve them falls under the category of none of their damn business. So they are not entitled to know that information. Now, you can disclose it if you wish. You know, if somebody asks you your credit card number, you can disclose that if you decide that's what you want to do. Nothing wrong with that. I mean, you can if you want, but there's no obligation that if somebody asks you for your credit card number, you have to tell them, right? I just want everyone to be clear because there's a lot of first-time job seekers, a lot of young people that are getting taken advantage of in this situation. You go down to the job interview and, you know, you're in the mode of like wanting to be forthcoming. You want them to think favorably about you. So you figure, okay, well, I'm here to answer questions. So any questions you have, I'll try and answer them to the best of my ability, right? But then that is abused and they ask you about things that are crossing the line into personal information, confidential information. And that includes information that makes you look bad. It gives a negative first impression of you if you disclose it. Okay? It just looks bad. It's not really bad, but it appears bad when they don't know you and they're just getting to know you. Right? This question is the king of that. Okay? So just be aware of that. They may ask about certain things, but A, it may look bad if you were to answer that fully, completely, honestly. Number two, they're not actually entitled to that information, you know, and a lot of people would consider that an overreach. They're asking you about personal things, confidential things that they're, you know, normally you wouldn't reasonably disclose that, like a credit card number, right? Okay, so be aware of that. And this question also includes that stuff too. Okay. Now, the other thing is, are you going down to this job interview to talk about your last job at length? Is that what you're here for? Absolutely not. That would be a distraction. It would take away valuable talk time that you could have been using to sell yourself, to say, look, this is how great I am. This is what I can do for you. Here's what I know. Here's what I have done. You know, here are my skills, right? Instead of talking about that stuff, you end up giving them all kinds of details about the last job you worked at that have nothing to do with this job, that don't even frame you in a positive light. Is that what you're there to do? Absolutely not. So it's very easy to get distracted by questions like this, have it take up all your talk time, and then there's no time left to actually sell yourself and make a good impression about why you would be the person they should pick, right? So these are all things going on in this question. That's why we have to answer this question diplomatically. We have to rehearse our answer. And when we go down to the job interview, it should be like muscle memory. You give your answer that you've worked out ahead of time and you've rehearsed. So it should be, you know, very easy to say when they ask you this question. Let's get into how you actually answer it now, okay? Okay, now, you could have left your last job for several reasons, right? One obvious reason is that you were laid off, okay? You weren't fired for cause. That means you didn't have a performance issue or anything like that. You were just laid off. The company was downsizing. They had to cut staff. It was almost random what jobs they eliminated. And you just unfortunately drew the short straw. You might have been laid off with a bunch of your peers all at the same time through no fault of your own, okay? If that was the situation, Here's how you handle it. First of all, it's okay to say that you were laid off. There's absolutely no issue with that. And it doesn't frame you in a bad light to say, like, I was laid off. If you were laid off as a part of a group, mention that, because that further gives evidence that there was nothing wrong with you. You were just a victim of circumstances. You could be an amazing employee, but this happened to you anyway. So it's okay to say that the company was downsizing, that your term expired, things like this. Okay. And say, I was laid off. That's the deal. And if you want to emphasize that it wasn't for cause, it was simply, cutbacks or some reason like that, that should be fine. And that's a good, understandable reason. So if that's your situation, you can just say that, no problem. On the other hand, if you decided to leave your last job voluntarily, okay, the company didn't lay you off and you weren't fired, they didn't kick you out, you decided independently, I'm going to leave. I'm going to give my notice and leave, okay? Once again, under most circumstances, that's fine to admit, okay? Now, with this situation, you will most likely be required to give a little bit of an explanation, because although it's okay to admit this, the danger is that they could get an impression of you as the type of employee that quits, like a job hopper. You only stay for a short amount of time. Something isn't perfectly to your liking, so you say, no, I'm out, that's it, I quit, right? I have a very thin skin, I can't tolerate any kind of inconvenience. The moment the job starts becoming not super fun for me, I leave, right? You don't want to give that impression. So it's good to give a little bit of an explanation for the circumstances that led to you deciding to leave, okay? So a good sort of blanket thing, if you really don't want to get into it, but is usually true to some degree for almost everybody, is you can say, well, there were no opportunities for growth at that organization. I took the job and it was great and I have no complaints about the people or the company. But there were no opportunities to move forward at that organization. And I'm ready to do more. That's the magic words. Those are the magic words. I'm ready to do more. Why are you here? I'm here because I'm ready to do more. No issues with my last job, was perfectly fine, but I'm ready to do more. And employers love that. Okay, they like people that they want to move forward, they want to learn, they want to grow. Those are all very good qualities. Okay, so if you left your last job, it's okay to admit that, give a very brief explanation, and if you don't really want to get into the soap opera of why you left, you want to keep it to 10 seconds or less, those are some good phrases. No opportunities for growth, and I was ready to do more. And that's what brings me here. Okay? Now we move on to the awkward part. Okay? If you were fired, right? You were terminated with cause. That means that in their eyes anyway, there was something wrong with you. Now, there's a lot of stuff to unpack here. I mean, you could have been working for a bunch of insane morons, right? And you were a tremendously amazing employee, but for whatever reason, they had a problem with you, right? It's a judgment call, right? Maybe you were terrible, or maybe you were awesome, but they were out to lunch, right? But either way, you were fired, okay? You were terminated with cause. What do you say if you're coming from that situation, okay? Now, I'm going to give you two answers here. I'm going to give you the answer that most recruiters will give you, and I'm going to give you my own recommendation. The answer that most recruiters will give you, which I feel is very self-serving and that you shouldn't do, is to say, is basically to admit that you were fired. You say, I was fired, okay? You explain what the issue was, why you were fired, and you explain what you learned from that experience, and then you explain how you've been working on it. Okay? So that's an answer that you will hear that's been put out into the ether quite a lot. Okay? Recruiters love this because it's less work for them. Instead of them having to dig and peel back the layers and find, who you are and what are your faults, they take the lazy way. They just ask you, so what are your faults? And you say, oh, well, let me tell you about it. I'm terrible. I was fired from my last job. Oh, yeah. I was drinking on the job and I was lazy and, I beat up my boss. Yeah, I know, huh? Yeah, it's kind of living the dream. But I'm working on it and I'm better now. And I'm ready to come here and have everything be rosy. They would love to be able to do that, to just get you to admit all your faults, air your dirty laundry, just unashamedly, unabashedly. They would love that. And so that's the answer you often hear recommended from recruiters, from interviewers. Not to mention the fact that this totally contradicts a lot of principles of how to do a job interview, right? It also totally contradicts a lot of the principles that recruiters are taught in recruitment theory, including the foundational principles of behavioral questions. They love to ask behavioral questions in job interviews. These are the questions where they say, tell me about a time, you did this, right? And you tell a story. Now, why do they ask those questions? It's based on the principle that past behavior predicts future behavior. They don't care about the past. They don't care what you did with some other company. They care about what you're going to do here if they were to hire you, right? So if you did this thing in the past, then it's highly likely that if you were put in that situation again, you would behave the same way, right? Right. So here you have the complete flip of that. Why did you leave your last job? Oh, I was fired. Okay. Well, if past behavior does indeed predict future behavior, then what we're getting from this is that you're the type of person that doesn't tend to work out and you end up having to be fired. So does that make you look like a good employee that we should engage? Absolutely not, right? According to their own principle, it doesn't hold up. This would be a terrible thing for you to say. Okay, so you want to try and avoid saying you were fired at all costs. Okay? Now there's some things you can do. Okay, to that end. And now we come to the answer that I do recommend, okay? Because if you were to follow that advice, this answer becomes like a sudden death elimination question, almost like the salary question. How much money do you need? You give it an open-ended question, you give a number, and then you're eliminated because unbeknownst to you, you set a number that was over their little hurdle number, right? They didn't tell you about, right? So you've just eliminated yourself. This question is exactly the same thing. If you were fired, you say, oh, I was fired. A lot of people will eliminate you outright, right? For the same reason. Okay, so here's what I say. Here's my recommended answer after all this song and dance. Okay, first of all, this is not a deposition. You're not put on the stand. You don't have to disclose what you did at some other job if you don't want to. Okay, how can we do this in an innocuous way? Well, first of all, I'd say don't say you were fired. That's a basic principle here. Speak instead about the problem that might have led to your firing. You could just say, well, I had a difference of opinion with my boss about several things, something like that. And so I decided to leave. You could do it like that. I would not have an issue with you saying something like that. Now, what's even more elegant that I would explain, and there's one good answer that if you can say this would be a good answer. And that is, you could say that the role kind of changed while you were there. And I signed on for a particular job. And over time, that job morphed into a completely different job. So my duties completely changed. And this new job that it ended up being, it did not play to my strengths or to my interest. So it didn't work out. The new job didn't really work out for me. It didn't work for me. But that's why I'm here, because that job ended up reiterating or reinforcing my interest and my strengths in being able to do the original job. And that's why I'm here. Something like that. If you can say that kind of thing, I'd recommend that. That would be an amazing answer. Okay? You focus on your strengths. You focus on how maybe the last job ended up not being a great fit, but your strengths would make you a great fit for this job, right? And you're doing a couple of things here. First of all, you're sort of deflecting the question. Secondly, you are bringing the conversation back to this job, because that's what you want to talk about in a job interview. You don't want to be there for 10 minutes talking about the details of what you did in some other job that has nothing to do with this job. Okay? You want to bring the discussion to this job, right? That's always going to be your efforts. Okay? If they want to talk about your past or what you did somewhere else, you always try and get off that question quickly, bring it back to this position and how you can be a great fit and what you can bring all the stuff you have to serve this job. Okay? So that would be how I'd answer this. Okay? Those are some options there depending on your situation. Hopefully that makes sense.